Welcome to VConf, Tom. We're excited to have you here. Thank you for being here. Before we kind of dive in, I think that you need no introduction, but just in case for everyone watching, Tom is the founder of GitHub. He's the creator of Jekyll, most recently Redwood.js, which y'all in the V community are probably familiar with, and also a handful of other things that you've created over the past decade or two here. And so I guess maybe to kind of kick us off, Tom, maybe you could kind of just talk about how you got into the web development world and just maybe start with, I think you're originally from Iowa, right?
That's right. So yeah, absolutely. I am Iowa. Yeah, I grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, right on the Mississippi. And my entire goal in high school was to move out of Iowa. So I didn't even apply to colleges in Iowa. I wanted to go coastal, MIT or Caltech or something. Well, I ended up at Harvey Mudd in California, but that was sort of the start of my journey. I'd always been into programming since I was a kid, since I was probably 10, as well as electronics and physics. I actually went to school for physics, decided it was too much math, thought I could change people's lives more quickly with programming. So that's the direction I went. I dropped out of college to join a startup. That one didn't do very well. Ended up working for myself for some years. That's where I invented Gravatar, the global avatar thing that WordPress owns now. I'd always been into computers. I always loved the idea that I could write text and a computer would do my bidding. It was just blew my mind. Right. And so getting into web stuff is pretty natural coming from computers as the internet evolved and the World Wide Web became a thing. And it's just amazing what has happened in our lifetimes that we have gone from literally no internet to what is today, how computers work and, AI and everything. It's just mind blowing to me. So fascinating. But yeah, I got into programming in college. I wrote Perl, then I wrote PHP, then I wrote Cold Fusion for a little while, and then Ruby on Rails. And that was really where I discovered true joy in programming.
Awesome. Yeah, and then we're actually a Rails stack at StackBlitz as well. And I think GitHub was very that GitHub had a huge impact on the growth of Ruby on Rails, in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And so actually back during that time, like when you were building GitHub, you wrote this blog post called Blogging Like a Hacker, where it effectively you kind of described it. For those of you watching that haven't read that blog post, I highly recommend reading it, kind of rewinding to 2008, because it was effectively, Tom wrote about how he came up with the idea for Jekyll, which was really, as far as I'm aware, one of the first static site generators, right?
It was one of the first. It was the third. There was one or two that I looked at and I was like, that's an interesting concept, but we can do better. So it was not maybe the first.
Yeah.
It was very early.
It was the first mainstream one though, right? That really had a lot of adoption. And that was a pretty big deal because, fast forwarding over the subsequent, decade and a half since then, static site generators, are used everywhere. They're, a very common thing. And so I'm kind of curious, I'm curious about kind of at that time, and I guess even looking back on it now, what's kind of your thought on, what happened with Jekyll and static site generators and kind of how that's evolved to today?
Yeah, well, we were building out the GitHub Pages functionality at GitHub, and that concept of being able to just commit to a Git repository and then have the contents there sort of reflected into some hosted website thing, that I think was the real kernel of it, right? Because people were kind of asking about how they might get files up on GitHub and host them there, and they're like, could we FTP files up to GitHub and then you could publish them as a website or something? Or we were looking at that concept and we're like, wait a second, why would you FTP them? You could just put them in a Git repository and then, that's what we do. And so we had that realization, and that became the kind of, pub push to deploy paradigm that is now so prevalent. And it's really a delightful mechanism. And I love that so many people use that. And so that's what Jekyll was, kind of this additional thing on top of GitHub Pages, where every site was treated as a Jekyll site if you did it in the right format and you had the right folders. We'd transform it for you, and you could have a blog or anything else you can do with Jekyll. So it was, that's why Jekyll is popular, I think, not because it on its own would it have been as successful as it was. Probably not. It was combined with the concept of push to a Git repository to then be able to publish an entire website online and have it be static, right? So it's super fast, it's secure, et cetera. All of that came along with it. And meanwhile, you're not going to ever lose any of that content because it's in a Git repository that's on GitHub. And that's what that blog post that you reference really talks about is I was tired of losing all the content of my previous blogs that were in some WordPress or, the movable type or whatever we were using back in the early 2000s for our blogs. I'd have them spun up somewhere and then they'd get deleted because I'd stopped paying attention to it for a year, and whoever I was hosting with, the credit card expired and they just delete everything. And I was like, crap. Right. So that paradigm, and that then led into what we now call sort of Jamstack, right? This approach of pre-building, having statically delivered content, and then enhancing it with APIs, JavaScript, et cetera. So it's really a fascinating story there. And I'm so happy to have been a part of that.
Yeah. And then that's what I was going to say is, that idea of like what you were just describing of, pushing something to the repo and then an action gets triggered to do a deploy or something like that. That I didn't even realize that aspect of it. That was prescient because, when you look at, speaking of like Jamstack, like, if you look at what Netlify really added, and you're one of the investors in Netlify as well, right?
Yeah.
Where they really took that to the next level, where you got to have this continuous deployment happening as you're pushing to a Git repo where it's static, and even adding in kind of dynamic, with like lambdas and edge functions and that sort of thing. But that really is all built on what you and the early team there at GitHub kind of landed on with GitHub Pages and Jekyll. In my view, like that's kind of transformed how all this stuff works, which is super.
Yeah.
Cool. I don't think a lot of people realize that. That's pretty mind blowing.
Yeah, Netlify kind of started as like an amped up GitHub Pages. Really, it was like doing very similar things, but it made SSL possible. Like that was something that we weren't doing well on GitHub Pages at the time, and just the performance and scalability of it was higher. And you'd use it for real commercial things. Where GitHub Pages we were never like, yeah, build your actual real business on GitHub Pages. Like that was never a recommended thing for you to do. Netlify just sort of elevated it to the next level, and then coined the term Jamstack so that everyone could think about like, oh, what is this new architecture? What can we do with it when we think about pre-rendered static pages and using JavaScript as sort of either third party or your own APIs that you're now consuming from those static pages. And then you get React involved, right? And you can statically deliver a whole React application and have that be talking to some backend database. Like it really created this awesome path for a new way to do things. Ironically new, where it's kind of like, is it new? Because it's really a throwback to just like a bunch of static files on an Apache server, like we used to do in the 90s. So everything old is new again, but we always are adding our, some modern little spice to it. And I love that about technology is we're always building on each other's ideas, and we're always experimenting and expanding the sort of the boundary of what we know how to do. And everyone's discovering the edges of that frontier.
Totally. And to that end, your latest project kind of in the web space is Redwood. And this has been something that's been growing a lot over the past few years, just from the outside looking in. And so I'm kind of maybe take us like 0 to 60 on like Redwood, what it is, and the problems that it's solving, and and how it's unique and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So Redwood.js is a full stack TypeScript and JavaScript web application framework. So if you want to build the next GitHub, go check out Redwood.js. It's in the same sort of category as Ruby on Rails or Laravel. Like it sort of tries to be the full package to do everything from your database, like all the way down to the database. So it comes with Prisma as an ORM. It uses GraphQL for the front end to talk to the back end, React on the front end. We include testing with Jest. We include the ability to run Storybook if you want to prototype your components or create a design resource for that. It integrates with Pinot for logging. We have integrated authentication providers, a bunch of them. So, with one command, you can set up Clerk or, Supabase Auth or Auth0 or a bunch of other authentication providers, as well as deployment. So if you want to deploy to different places, one click and you can essentially set up all the necessary machinery to deploy to Netlify or Vercel, or to Render or Fly.io, or you could go, we have a strategy called bare metal where you can deploy directly to AWS or, whatever machine you have laying around that you want to co-locate somewhere. Most people don't do that anymore, but you can do that with bare metal. And so we try to do the whole stack, even more than Ruby on Rails does, like really thinking about like everything from zero to a fully functional web application. What do you need to spin that up? And we want to build that framework so that more people can build more stuff faster.
And that was actually going to be my exact question, is like, especially because you've been in the Rails world, like a lot of people I talk to in the JavaScript world have never actually done stuff with Rails. And so they're not aware of how good Rails is in a lot of ways. But there's been kind of this missing piece in the JavaScript world of how fast you could move with Rails and like the sort of things that there's a gem for like everything, right? And so it sounds like you're really building that. And so I guess to kind of like, for example, one of the things in the Rails world, in like the data layer, like Active Record was the staple for that, right? And so how do you see that part of this picture evolving, in the JavaScript, and even particularly in like the Redwood side? Are GraphQL and Prisma really the things that you view as here to stay, or are there even more opportunities for growth in this area?
Yeah, so we chose the components a couple of years ago, and so we made some bets, and I think those technologies are really strong. Prisma is a really great ORM. GraphQL. So the GraphQL story is interesting right now. This leads me to maybe talk about the future of Redwood, which is React Server Components. So this will be my answer to that a little bit. Is GraphQL is awesome for a set of problems, but it is not the perfect solution for every problem. Right? It comes with some overhead. You have to build your SDL files. There's kind of more steps involved in the whole round trip, and that's really great. I think it's especially great if you've got multiple clients that are consuming your backend. So you can build. So one of the reasons that Redwood is architected the way it is this idea that you could have a single backend, write your business logic once as a GraphQL API, and then consume it from a React web front end, or consume it from a mobile application written in React Native or something else. It could be consumed by a command line tool. It could be consumed by anything, any kind of client, right? And you have a single backend. And I think that's a great way to do it, but it comes at the expense of a little more trouble up front. And so prototyping something very quickly with Redwood there's some additional friction. So we've been trying to solve problems around server-side rendering so that you can get a full web page delivered on the first request. This is important for SEO as well as OG tags, so it can unfurl in Twitter and Slack and other places. And in solving this problem, there was a couple of ways we could do it, but we've decided on React Server Components because that's obviously the future of React. The React team has made it pretty clear that that's the direction that they're going, that they would love more people to implement that. And so by being an early player in that arena, we hope to really help direct that in a way that's excellent for developers and works really well with the concepts that exist in Redwood. One of the advantages of doing this will be that GraphQL will become an optional part of Redwood. So you'll be able to do your server-side logic, your business logic server-side without any GraphQL in the mix. You'll just talk directly to your database via Prisma, right in your sort of your cell. We call them cells. It's kind of the data fetching primitive in Redwood. And so that'll be sort of the default. But then you'll have a first class, really amazing, really robust, great experience with GraphQL. If later on you say, well, I want to do a mobile client and I'd love to use GraphQL for that. Using Redwood to now build you the GraphQL as well as your primary application that you're just using React Server Components for, that's going to be an amazing experience. So it becomes this sort of optional add-on because of the history of Redwood. But we're trying to make it a lot easier for people to approach Redwood and get started right away with their sort of weekend hack projects that then grow into startups and companies. Because that's what I'm really interested in, is people building things that matter, like startups. I love startups. I do a lot of angel investing. And I love that. So giving people this path from zero to startup, essentially.
That's really cool. I mean, and that's that is not the reason I expected to hear actually of why you're going into React Server Components, but it's such an excellent reason. Which is, I mean, I think a lot of people that have been looking at this stuff, like people that have been using GraphQL, everything you said is very true. Where there's more friction. Like when you are having multiple clients, there's a lot of value in having it. When you're trying to get started quickly and iterate quickly, it actually matters more that you just have something pull together that's functional, even if it's just like a web client or something like that, versus something that's going to be able to work across all platforms. But it's cool that Prisma or that Redwood is actually already set up to have the GraphQL portions of that there, so that as you grow your app on Redwood, you're able to start and iterate really quickly with React Server components. And then as your project or company grows, you don't have to do anything more to actually set up your a GraphQL sort of endpoint to be able to do mobile or et cetera. Or other use cases where GraphQL would just be a better choice. Like that's a very eloquent kind of story as far as how people can get started with Redwood.
Yeah,
one more big deal for you.
Yeah, it's super exciting. We have the work on React Server Components is we have experimental versions of Redwood that you can try out today. You can go on the Redwood JS forums and you can find how to install the experimental versions that have React Server Components and that use the React 18 streaming. That stuff is working. We have a ways to go still to sort of refine the user experience and exactly how you are coding everything. Just the developer experience for all of this is still a little bit up in the air, but it's coming together, and hopefully by the end of the year we'll have something fairly stable to release. But it's really exciting, and the ability to really craft what your user experience is, like that's what it's always about. And React Server Components, to me, gives developers the flexibility to say, you can get them content very quickly. It can be server rendered, but you can choose where you want to have a loader and have then the results stream down on the same connections. You're not even, it reduces the complexity. Like you're still doing the calculations server side, like the business logic is executing, but you're not having to do anything extra to ship that down once it's done. It's just part of the streaming part of React 18 and React Server Components. So it's just I think it's a beautiful paradigm. I think it's going to work really well for us. And it allows us to reserve GraphQL as kind of a layer on top. Or if you can start with that if that's what you want to do. Like you don't have to use the React Server Components to do your logic. You'll still be able to use Redwood the way that you use it today using GraphQL. But here's another really quick, great point about GraphQL is once you do, like if you do go down that route where you start building a GraphQL API, you have a team that knows how to do that. So they know how to do performance and security well with GraphQL. Once you have a GraphQL API, front-end developers love consuming GraphQL. Like it's an amazing experience. It's better than having to dig through the database directly with your ORM and make sure all the security stuff is in place and you don't overfetch, whatever. So consuming a GraphQL API is amazing. And we want to make that easy too in Redwood so that at some point, even if you didn't start with GraphQL, if you end up with a GraphQL API in your cells for your data fetching, instead of just doing reaching directly for Prisma as your ORM, you're actually making GraphQL calls server side. So they're never going outside of your servers. You're just fetching from GraphQL directly in your data fetching because it's GraphQL could be such a beautiful API. So It creates there's this beautiful evolution over time.
Yeah, that is really cool. And one thing I wanted to ask, so we're at VConf, and so Vite is I think you all adopted Vite for the internals of Redwood. I can't remember if it was like a year ago or some time ago. And I'm kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts on Vite? What is Vite bringing to the Redwood story?
Yeah, we just recently made it the default. So in the latest release of Redwood, Vite is now the default. So if you spin up a new Redwood project, you're using Vite by default. We're using Webpack before. And we've had, this has been a year-long process to make this happen. It turns out migrating from Webpack to Vite in a complex framework takes a little bit of time and hair pulling, but we got it done, and it's just great. The reasons that we chose to move to Vite are, speed, obviously. Like it's just an incredibly fast build tool and server, and gives us the speed that we needed. So performance. Especially when you're talking about adding a lot of code on top of it, like the more that you're bundling, the worse that, sort of we saw Webpack performance get, and Vite sort of takes care of that. So yeah, at first the two are maybe not so different, but once you start building out your application and you've got, hundreds of thousands of components and things that you're building, it becomes a problem. Also easier to see a path forward to SSR and streaming, the work that we were doing to make React 18 work and React Server Components. Doing that with Webpack was not as clear how that was going to be accomplishable. That path was more clear with Veed. So that was another big reason to do it. And there's other things, just the momentum of the software and the community around it are so great. So it feels like Veed is the way forward, and we want to be using modern tooling. So that's a big part of it. And Redwood is much faster because of it.
Awesome. Yeah, and that seems to be a common reason set there why a lot of products have been moving to Veed. I mean, the ecosystem has been is now, I think, one of the biggest draws, where you have great projects like Redwood that are coming in and building fantastic tooling. In the case of Redwood, like in the React sort of ecosystem around React Server Components, et cetera. Having that like level of collaboration be able to happen then kind of across other projects that are trying to use these things is really ideal. So it's super cool to see you all using Veed. And I think we're getting near the end of time. And so I have one question for you, maybe to cap this off, and then we've got a couple questions from folks that have been tweeting us on Twitter. So just, we've kind of through this conversation talked about the past 10, 15 years, that you spent in the web development world. I'm kind of curious, as you look forward to the next 5 to 10 years, how do you kind of see stuff evolving? Like, where do you think we're going to be? And it's pretty broad, but I'm curious to hear your answer.
That's a tough question. Anytime you try to predict the future of technology, you're getting yourself in a little bit of trouble. So I will say that I think one of the most interesting things, of course, is AI and how AI is going to change how we code and the level of abstraction that we code. So, and I think that's going to be a bigger change than any change that we see within a specific language, right? Like TypeScript is going to continue to become more dominant. At some point, probably it will replace JavaScript which could be very nice. Like, it's kind of annoying to have these two things that then you're like trying to support. The JavaScript, the legacy of JavaScript is quite messy, shall we say, right? We're like trying to convert things over to ESM only, and it's like a huge, monstrous pain. And I hope that we see a future of JavaScript and TypeScript that is less complicated. That would be nice, right? Like we'd all be happier people for it. But maybe we're not writing a lot of code anymore, right? Like we're working at a higher level of abstraction via AI. I don't know exactly what form that takes. I think right now having things like ChatGPT and Copilot are amazing. They really allow you to go faster, and they're augmenting sort of human capability. I'm not sure at what point that changes and we're writing more English than we are writing code. But I'm a little bit skeptical, because at some point you start writing so much English that you wish that you were just writing code, right? You're like, I need to be so specific to get this web page to look how I want it to look, that like, just give me the damn like text editor directly. Like, just let me code this. Like, can I just code this, please? Like you're trying to convince the machine you're like, no, could you move it 5 pixels to the right? It's like, is that the world that we want to live in? I'm not sure, but I think that abstraction levels go up. So I think that there's maybe some hybrid that is like a programming language, more like what we use today, but allows you levels of abstraction that are higher. So instead of having to write all of the 9,000 lines to build a good kind of a form, right, on the web today, there's maybe some shorthand that is augmented with LLMs, where you're like, let me just write like a DSL, essentially. So maybe DSLs become more powerful, and you can dip into those where it makes sense, and you can be more specific in the language that you're choosing where that makes sense. Because writing things over and over and doing all that machinery underneath is fatiguing, but at the same time, having the specificity, like that's what allows us to create new, unique things, right? If all you have access to is Lego blocks, how can you ever create an organic shape, like with smooth edges? Like you can't. It's impossible. It can't be done, right? Like you can't do that with Legos. And I think the same is true when our level of abstraction is high enough that it starts to look like Lego blocks. We forget that maybe you can create other kinds of shapes that have smooth edges. And I think there's danger there. There's danger in it limiting our imagination. So I'm not sure if that answered your question at all, but those are the things that I think about.
That is, I love that. That is an extremely rad answer. to that question. And now I could talk to you for another hour just on this vein of things. But I love it. That fantastic answer. And so a couple of questions from people on Twitter for you. One is from a person named Rob Cameron. He said, ask him about his secret project Wonder Cards. What is this?
So this is a project. So I used to do a lot of electronics as a kid. I loved electronics. I loved building things. I had all these kits and stuff, but I never became, it was never a professional goal of mine. And so over the last 20 or so years, so much has happened in electronics, or 30, I should say. Geez, I'm getting old. All these things have happened, especially around microcontrollers and what we've accessed, Raspberry Pi and things like that. So about a year ago, I was like, I'm gonna brush up on this stuff. I need a project to build something. So I have a bunch of Sonos speakers in my house in the ceilings, and I want to be able to control them. But I hate pulling out my phone to control these speakers because it's like I have to open up Spotify, and then I have to make sure the right speaker is selected, and then I have to choose what I'm playing, and like the whole thing takes forever, and it's mediated by this device, and I don't like that. I also don't like talking to devices. I don't like being like, "Hey Alexa, could you play whatever?" Like it's just weird, and I don't like have devices around listening to me all the time. It weirds me out a little bit. And I love, being a child of the 80s and 90s. I loved having a case of CDs on the wall, right? Where you could like see your music and you'd be like, I'm going to listen to this album. And you'd listen to like a whole album. Like that was cool. I like that. And so I wanted to build this device that would be a smart speaker controller, but that was beautiful. It didn't look like a 3D printed thing. And I don't actually have one here, but I can show you this. I can show you the prototype of what this looks like. This was actually like laser cut. So there's these like layers here. So it doesn't look as beautiful as the real one. But the idea is that you have, cards, and these are NFC cards, right? Near field communication cards, like you tap into a hotel with. And these are cool because you can write data to them. So if you write a URL to this, like a Spotify URL, then you tap it on this device, boop, it'll make a little booping noise. And then it'll play this album on the speaker that it's bound to. And then if you want to adjust the volume, then you can adjust the volume, because like that's the next thing that you need to do when you play something on a speaker, right? You're like, oh, I was having a party. Oh my God, I need to turn the volume down. Like if you can't do that directly, you're like, well, let me pull out my phone now. Like that's dumb. So anyway, so I built in a volume controller, and if you press it, then it'll pause. And if you press it, it'll play. And if you double press it, it'll skip. And so I did all the electronics. This is like the early electronics. Wow. This is an ESP8266. This is like the first kind of version that I made. This is the NFC card reader. This is the rotary controller for the dial there. And then things have become more sophisticated since then. So I started designing the PCB boards. So this is the ESP8266 chip that's on this dev board here. But you don't need a dev board if you can just build the PCB yourself. So you can buy this component and have that made and get the USB thing on the end. And so now I'm building a version that actually uses an ESP32 that looks like this. And so the ESP32 is down here. So it's a bigger chip, but it has Bluetooth on it, because one of the annoying things is provisioning these chips. You need to connect them to Wi-Fi. And in order to do that, on this one, your only option really is to connect to it as a Wi-Fi point. And that's annoying. Like it's just a bad experience. You're like, disconnect from your normal Wi-Fi and connect to this, and then fill out your details and then disconnect. Anyway, the modern experience is to get an app and then connect to it via Bluetooth and then provision it via Bluetooth. And so that's what the ESP32 can do. Anyway, all this is to say, this is a project that I've been doing for the last like year, and it's super duper fun. And I bought a CNC mill and I have a 3D printer from before, and it's just, I'm trying to do the whole thing myself, like all the code, all the hardware, to the most practical level. I wish I had a finished version of one of these here.
It looks amazing.
The cases are CNC milled now. So this one is like a stack of layers, and this one is actually CNC milled, but nice. It hasn't been stained or finished or anything yet. I love the
idea. I mean, it kind of reminds me of having like a record. It's like a vinyl, right? It's like a digital vinyl where you want to like, you pull it, you have this little stack of cards on the shelf, so you take it off, you play it or whatever, Yep. I like that idea. That's super cool. That's
exactly.
Right.
I'll send you.
I'm blown. No idea.
I'll actually send you thanks. I'll send you a photo that you can put up right now in post-processing that shows the final version with the cards and everything, so that people understand what the hell I'm talking about.
Cool. Heck yeah. Sounds good. Well, Tom, thank you so much for making the time. This has been a lot of fun chat with you. I could chat for hours longer here. So thank you again for being part of BConf, and looking forward to chatting more. Thank you for being an investor in StackBlitz too.
You're welcome. And absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was a blast.